Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to Reading Thucydides Peloponnesian War. Today, we're doing the 11th year of the war, both the spring and the summer and the winter of it, because it's going to be short. It's going to be relatively short compared to other things. It's about from chapter 25 to chapter 39. So, therefore, it doesn't make sense to do two. The winter is actually only like from chapter 36. Chapter 36 to chapter 39, so three chapters. So it doesn't make any real sense to kind of do a separate video like I know we've been doing winter thing and just do one video for the whole year 11. Again, we're using the Thucydides landmark edition. Hold on, right here. Using the Crawley translation. This we're using it on Google Books, on Google Books online version, which has its faults we've talked about before. And we've last time we've had a meeting, we saw chapter we did the winter of the 10th year of the war. So as we turn to the and we addressed the treaty, and we looked at the treaty and talked about the treaty in that sense. Um, Here, well, this is weird because uh, it starts on two. Um, I suspect that I think there's an error here in the text. Um, well, I think that's it continues. This line here really continues the previous chapter. The alliance was not made long. This alliance of this, of these agreement was made not long after treaty. The Athenians gave back the men from the island to the Spartans, and the summer of the 11th month began. This completes the history of the First War, which occupies the whole of the first 10 years. After the treaty and the alliance between the Spartans concluded, and this now begins, right here begins chapter 25. Um, I think that line there ended it ended chapter 24. So after the treaty and alliance between the Spartans and Athens concluded after the 10 years of the wars and the effort of Peloponnesus of Sparta and the Archon of Achaia at Athens, the cities which had accepted these agreements were at peace, but the Corinthians and some cities in the Peloponnesians tried to disturb the settlement and immediately agitated against Sparta. Moreover, the Athenians, as time went on, began to suspect the Spartans because they had not performed some of the provisions of the treaty. And although for 6 years and 10 months they abstained from invasion of each other's territories, yet abroad, an unstable armistice did not prevent either party doing the other serious injuries until they are finally obliged to break the treaty made after 10 years of war and to have recourse to open hostilities. 26. The history of this period has also been written by the same Thucydides, an Athenian, in chronological order of the events, and by summers and winters, up to the time when the Spartans and their allies put an end to the Athenian Empire and took the long walls and the Piraeus. The war had then lasted for 27 years in all. Only a mistaken judgment can object to including the interval of the treaty in the war. Looked in light of the facts, it cannot. Looked in light of the facts, it cannot. It will be found be rationally considered a state of peace, as neither party gave nor got back all what they agreed, apart from the violations of it which occurred on both sides in the Metatian and Epidaurian wars and other instances, and the fact that the Allies in the regions of Thrace were were as open hostility as were in open hostility as ever, and that the Boeotians had only a truce renewed every 10 days. So that the first 10 year that the first 10 years of war, the treacherous armistice that followed it, and the subsequent war will calculating by the seasons, be found to make up the number of years which I have mentioned, with the difference of a few days, and to provide an instant of faith in oracles being for once justified by the events. I certainly remember that all along, from the beginning to the end of the war, it was commonly declared that it would last thrice 9 years. I have lived through the whole of it, being as an age to comprehend events and giving my attention to them in order to know the exact truth about them. It was also my fate to be in exile from my country for 20 years after my command at Amphipolis, and being present with both parties, and more especially with the Peloponnesians by reason of my exile. I had leisure to observe affairs more closely. I will accordingly now relate the differences that arose after the 10 Years' War, the breach of the treaty, and the hostilities that followed. After the conclusions of the 50-year peace and the subsequent alliance, the embassies from the Peloponnese, which had been summoned for the business, returned to Sparta. Most of them went straight home, but the Corinthians first turned aside to Argos and openly negotiated with some of the men in office there, pointing out that Sparta could have no good end in view, but only subjugation of the Peloponnesians, or she would have never entered into treaty or alliance with the once detested Athenians, and that the duty of consulting for the safety of the Peloponnesians had now fallen upon Argos, who should immediately pass a decree inviting any Hellenic city that chooses, such a city being independent and accustomed to meet fellow powers upon fair and equal grounds of law and justice, to make a defense alliance with the Argives and appoint a few individuals with plenipotentiary power, instead of making the people the medium for negotiations, in order that, in the case of the applicant being rejected, the fact of his overtures might not be made public. They said that many would come over from hatred of the Spartans. After this explanation of their views, of the Corinthians returned home. The persons with whom they had communicated reported the proposal of their government and people, and the archives passed a decree and chose 12 men to negotiate an alliance for any Hellenistic city that wished it, except Athens and Sparta, neither of which should be able to join without referring the issue to the Argive people. Argos came into the plan all the more readily because she saw that the war with Sparta was inevitable, her treaty with Sparta being on the point of expiring, and also because she hoped to gain the supremacy of the Peloponnesians. For all this time, Sparta has sunk very low in public estimation because of her disasters, while the Argives were in the most flourishing condition, having taken no part in the war against Athens, but having, on the contrary, profited largely by their neutrality. The Argives accordingly prepared to receive into alliance any of the Hellenes that desired it. The Menatians and their allies were the first to come over through the fear of the Spartans, having taken advantage of the war against Athens to reduce a large part of Arcadia into subjugation. They thought that Sparta would not leave them undisturbed in their conquest now if she had leisure to interfere, and consequently were glad to turn to a powerful city like Argos, um, with a historical enemy, the historic enemy of Sparta, and a sister democracy. Upon the defection of Menetia, the rest of the Peloponnesian at once began to consider following her example, thinking that the Manetians would not have changed side without good reasons. Besides, they were angry with Sparta, among other reasons, for having inserted in the treaty with Athens that it should be consistent with their oath for both parties, the Spartans and the Athenians, to add to or take away from it according to their discretion. It was this clause that was the real origin of the panic in the Peloponnesus, by exciting suspicion of the Spartans and the Athenian combining their against their liberties. But any alteration should properly have been made conditional upon the consent of the whole body of the allies. Because of these apprehensions, there was a very general desire in each city to place itself in alliance with Argos. Here is the example. Arcadia is here, Manichaea here, this Corinth is here, Argos is here. So this is like the connections to this. Right. So, um, um, something happened to the screen. Doo, 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 doo. Ooh. Oh, this is weird. Mm. Sorry about that. I had to fix the screen. Something was wrong with the image. It decided to go lose color, and I just had to refresh the page. In the meantime, the Spartans, perceiving the agitation going on in the Peloponnesus, and that Corinth was the author of it, was herself about to enter an alliance with the Argives, sent ambassadors there in hoping to preventing what was in contemplation. They accused Corinth of having brought it all about, and told her that could not desert Sparta and become the allies of Argos without violation of her oath to the crime which she had already committed in not accepting the treaty with Athens, when it had been explicitly agreed that the decision of the majority of the allies should be binding on all, unless the gods or heroes stood in the way. Corinth, in her answer, which she delivered before those of her allies who had, like her, refused to accept the treaty, and whom she had previously invited to attend, refrained from openly stating the injuries she complained of, such as the failure to recover Solarium and Tacreum from the Athenians, or any other point in which she thought she had come off badly. Instead, she took shelter under the pretext that she could not give up her Thracian allies, to whom her separate individual security had been given when they first rebelled against Parthia, and as well upon subsequent occasion. She denied, therefore, that she committed any violations of her oath to the allies by not entering into the treaty with the Athenians. Since she had sworn upon the faith of the gods to her Thracian friends, she could not honestly give them up. Besides, the clause of the treaty was, unless the gods or the heroes stand in the way, and it appeared to her, in this case, that the gods stood in the way. This was what she said on the subject of her former oaths. As to the Argive alliance, she would confer with her friends and do what was right. The Spartan envoys returning home, some Argive ambassadors who happened to be in Corinth, urged her to conclude the alliance without further delay, but were told to attend at the next Congress to be held at Corinth. Immediately afterwards, an Elan embassy arrived, and at the first making an alliance with Corinth, went on from there to Argos according to their instructions, and became allies to the Argives, their country being just then an enemy with Sparta and uh, Lepreum. Sometime back, there had been a war between the Lepreans and some of the Arcadians, and the Eleans, being called in by the former with the offer of half their lands, had put an end to the war, and leaving the lands in the hands of the Leprean occupiers, had imposed upon them the tribute of talent to the Olympian Zeus. Till the war against Athens, this tribute was paid by the Lepreans, who had took the war as an excuse for no longer doing so, and now who then took the war as an excuse for no longer doing so. They were paying that and took the Athens war that is not paying so. Um, and upon Elan's using force, appealed to Sparta. This case thus submitted to her arbitration, but the Eleans, suspecting the fairness of the tribunal, abandoned this submission and waged lace to the Epean territories. The Spartans nevertheless decided that the Lepreans were independent and the Eleans aggressors, and as they did not abide by the arbitration, sent a garrison of hoplites into Lemprium. Upon this, the Eleans, holding that Sparta had received one of their rebel subjects, put forward an agreement providing that each allied city should come out of the war against Athens in possession of what they had at the beginning, and considering that justice had not been done them went over to the Argives, and now made an alliance through their ambassador, who had been instructed for that purpose. Immediately after them, the Corinthians and the Thracian uh, Cal, okay, Chal, okay, this is hard to say. Chalcidians, became allies of Argos. Meanwhile, the Boeotians and the Megarians, who acted together, remained quiet, being left to do as they pleased by Sparta, and thinking that the Argive democracy would not agree so well with their aristocratic form of government as the Spartan constitution. Okay, so therefore, who acted together remained quiet because they were afraid that the Argives of the democracy might not doing this. Okay, might not agree with this. About the same time, uh, uh, um, um, about the same time in the summer, Athens succeeded in reducing Sion, put the adult males to death, and making slaves of the women and children, giving the land to the Plataeans to live on. She also brought back the Delians to Delos, moved by her misfortunes on the field and by the commands of the god at Delphi. Um, Meanwhile, the Phoenicians and the Locrians commenced hostilities. The Corinthians and Argives, now being alliance, went to Tege to bring about its defection from Sparta, thinking that if so considered a city could also be persuaded to join, all the Peloponnesian would be on their side. But when the Tegeans said that they would do nothing against Sparta, and hitherto zealous Corinthian relaxed their activity and began to fear that none of the rest would now come over, still they went to the Boeotians and tried to persuade them to join the alliance and adopt a common action, generally with Argos and themselves, and also begged them to go with them to Athens and obtain for them a 10-day truce similar to that made between the Athenians and the Boeotians not long after the 50-year truce. And in the event that the Athenians refusing to renounce the armistice and not make any truce in future without Corinth. These were the requests of the Corinthians. The Boeotians refused on the subject of the Argive alliance, but went with them to Athens, where, however, they failed to obtain a 10-day truce. The Athenians answered was that the Corinthians had truce already as allies of Sparta. Nevertheless, the Boeotians did not renounce their 10-day truce, in spite of the prayers and reproaches of the Corinthians for their breach of faith. And these last had to content themselves with a de facto armistice with Athens. The same summer, the Spartans marched into Arcadia with their whole levy under Prioplex, Axis, Prioplex, Anaxis, Pelestoanaxa, Anax, Pelestoanax, okay, son of Pausanias, king of Sparta, against the Parrhasians, who were the subject of Mantia, and a faction whom had invited their aid. They also meant to demolish, if possible, the fort at Calypsia, which the Menetians had built in garrison in the Parathian territory as a hostile base against the district of Ceramis in Laconia. The Spartans accordingly laid waste to the Parrhasian country, and the Menetians, placing their city in the hands of the Argive garrison, addressed themselves to the defense of their confederacy. But being unable to save Calypsa or the Parrhasian cities, went back to Menetia. Meanwhile, the Spartans made the Parrhasians independent, razed the fortress, and returned home. The same summer, some soldiers from Thrace who had gone out with Bradius came back, having been brought from Thrace after the treaty of Thucydides, and the Spartans decreed that the Helots who had fought with Bradius should be freed and allowed to live where they liked, and not long afterwards settled them in with Nepodamus at Leprium, which is situated on the Laconian and Elasian border. The Spartans being at this time at enemy hostility or dislike, enmity with Elis. Those, however, of the Spartans who had been taken prisoner on the island and had surrendered their arms, it was feared, supposed that they were to be subject to some degradation in consequence of their misfortune. So made some attempt at revolution, if left in possession of their full rights. These were therefore at once deprived of some of their rights, although some of them were in office at the time, and thus they were barred from taking office or buying or selling anything. After some time, however, their rights were restored to them. The same summer, the Delians took Trassus and a city on Achaia near Altos, and in alliance with Athens. During the whole of the summer, intercourse between Athens and the Peloponnesians continues, although each party began to suspect the other immediately after the treaty because of the places specified in not being specified in it not being restored. Sparta, to whom lot it had fallen to begin by restoring Amphipolis and the other cities, had not done so. She had equally failed to get the treaty accepted by her Thracian allies, or by the Boeotians, or the Corinthians, although she had continued promising to unite with Athens and compelling their compliance, if it were longer refused. She also kept fixing a time at which those who are still refused to come in were to be declared enemies of both parties, but took care not to bind herself to any written agreement. Meanwhile, the Athenians, seeing none of these promises actually fulfilled, began to suspect the honesty of her intentions, and consequently not only refused to comply with her demands for Pyros, but also repented having given up the prisoners from the island, and kept a tight hold of the other places until Sparta's part of the treaty should be fulfilled. Sparta, on the other hand, said she had done what she could, having given up the Athenians prisoner of war and her possessions, evacuated Thrace, and performed everything else in her power. Amphipolis, she said, it was out of her hands to restore, but she would endeavor to bring Boeotia and Corinthians into the treaty to recover Panactium, and sent home all the Athenian prisoners of war in Boeotia. Meanwhile, she says, then Paos be restored, or at least that the Messalians and Helots should be withdrawn, as her troops had been from Thrace, and the place garrisoned, if necessary, by Athenians themselves. After a number of different conferences held during the summer, she succeeded in persuading Athens to withdraw from the Messalians from Palos and the rest of the Helots and deserters from Laconia who were accordingly settled by her at Caphelia. Thus, during the summer, there was peace and intercourse between the two people. The next winter, however, winter of the 11th year, the ephors under whom the treaty had been made were no longer in office, and some of their successors were directly opposed to it. Embassies now from the Spartan confederacies and the Athenian Boeotians and Croatians also presented themselves in Athens, and after much discussion and no agreement between them, they were returning to their homes. When Cleobus and Xenaxes, the two ephors who were the most anxious to terminate the treaty, took advantage of this opportunity to communicate privately with the Boeotians and the Corinthians, advising them to act as much as possible together, instructing the former first to enter alliance with Argos, and then to try bringing themselves and the Argives into alliance with Sparta. The Boeotians would thereby feel least compulsion to join the Attic Treaty, and the Spartans would prefer to gain friendship and alliance of Argos, even at the price of hostility to Athens and rupture of the treaty. The Boeotians knew that an honest friendship with Argos had long been the desire of Sparta, for the Spartans believed that this would considerably facilitate the conduct of the war outside the Peloponnesian. Meanwhile, they begged the Boeotians to place Pantocraeum in Sparta's hands in order that she might, if possible, obtain Pelos in exchange for it, or so be a better position to resume hostilities of Athens. After receiving these instructions from their governments, from Zenares and Cleobulus and other friends of Sparta at Sparta, the Boeotians and the Corinthians departed. On their way home, they were joined by two persons in high office at Argos, who waited for them on the road, and who now explored with them the possibility of the Boeotians joining the Corinthians, Illyrians, and Mentorians and becoming allies of Argos, thinking that if this could be effected, they would be able, thus unified, to make peace or war as they pleased, either against Sparta or any other power. The Boeotian envoys were pleased at thus hearing themselves additionally asked to do what their friends at Sparta had told them. And the two Argives, perceiving that the proposal was agreeable, departed with a promise to send ambassadors to Boeotians. On their arrival, Boeotians reported to the Boeotarchs, which had been sent to them. They reported to what had been said to them at Sparta, and also by the Argives who had met them. And the Boeotarchs, the leaders, pleased with the idea, embraced it with all the more eagerness from the lucky coincidence of Argos, soliciting the very thing wanted by their friends at Sparta. Shortly afterwards, ambassadors appeared from Argos with the proposal initiated, and the Botox approved of the terms and dismissed the ambassadors with a promise to send envoys to Argos to negotiate the alliance. In the meantime, it was decided that the Botarchs and the Corinthians, the Megreans, and the envoys from Thrace first exchange oaths together to give each other whatever to give help to each other whenever it was required, and not to make war or peace except in common. After which the Boeotians and the Megreans, who acted together, should make an alliance with Argos. But before the oaths were taken, the Botox communicated these proposals to the four consuls of the Boeotians, in whom the supreme power resides, and advised them to exchange oaths with all such cities as would be willing to enter into a larger defense league with the Boeotians. But the members of the Boeotian council refused their assent to the proposal, being afraid of offending Sparta, and by entering into a league with the deserter Corinth. The Botox, not having acquainted them with what had been passed at Sparta, and with the advice given by Cleobus and Xenoxes and the Boeotian partisans there, namely that they should become allies with Corinth and Argos at the preliminary to joining up with Sparta. They had supported that even if they should say nothing about this at all, the consuls would not vote against what had been decided and recommended by the Botarchs. When this difficulty arose, the Corinthians and the envoys from Thrace departed without anything having been concluded, and the Botarchs, who had previously intended, after carrying the point, to try and effect the alliance with Argos, now gave up bringing the Argive question before the consuls, or sending to Argos the envoys whom they had promised, and a general coldness and delay ensued in the matter. In the same winter, Mecabrian, Sabrian, which had an Athenian garrison inside it, was assaulted and taken by the Olythians. Okay. All this time, negotiation had been going on between the Athenians and the Spartans about the conquest still remaining obtained by each. And the Spartans hoped, if the Athenians were to get back Panacea from the Boeotians, she might recover Pest. Now sent an embassy to the Boeotians and begged them to place Panaceum and their Athenian prisoners in her hand, in order that she might exchange them for Pylos. This the Boeotians refused to do unless Sparta made a separate alliance with them, as she had done with Athens. Sparta knew that this would be a breach of faith with Athens, as it had been agreed that neither of them should make peace or war without the other. Yet wishing to obtain Pactium, which she also hoped to exchange for Pylos, with the party who pressed for the dilution of the treaty strongly possessing for the Boeotian alliance. She raised at length, concluded the alliance just as the winter gave to spring, and Pactium was already instantly raised. And so the 11th year of the war ended, and this ends the 39th chapter. Okay, if you have any questions or comments, put them there below on the comments area, and I will reply to them when I see them. If you like what I said, we've read here, not what I said, but we've read and reviewed here about this 11th year of the war. Like it, share it with your friends. If you want to subscribe, please subscribe. If you want to help me on doing this more of this, you can do it. There's ways to do it. Check below, subscribe star. Patreon. And I wish you all, you can also follow me on social media also, but I wish you all a great day. So thank you. Bye bye.